lecture. So in part one, we were mostly looking at how do we kind of classify joints and the different types of joints. In part two, we want to look at actually the movements that are created within the joints, and then in part three, we'll come back and we'll look at some specific joints in the body. Okay, so this one we're mostly looking at movements, and we want to be able to sort of know what movements each joint provides and know what the proper names for each of those movements is going to kind of be. So skeletal muscles, and we're going to do our whole next unit is going to be on skeletal muscles, but they're going to be the thing that kind of produces the force that sort of allows us to kind of move our joints. So skeletal muscles are going to have an origin and an insertion, and what you really want to think about it as a start and a finish. Okay, but there's two important distinctions, and the origin of a muscle is going to be the attachment to the immovable or less movable bone, and what I really want you to think about is it's going to be the stable part. Okay, so we need a stable part, and then we need a movable part. We can't have two movable parts or we get this very kind of unstable sort of movements. Okay, so the origin, again, we'll come back to this when we look at the muscle chapter, but you want to think about it as this sort of immovable or the stable part of a contraction. And then the insertion is going to be the part that's going to be attached to the movable part of the bone. Okay, and we'll kind of take a look at this in a minute when we take a look at the bicep and sort of the elbow flexion. Okay, but origin, stable part, insertion of a muscle is going to be the part that's going to move with a muscular contraction. So movement occurs when muscles contract across a joint, and the insertion is going to move towards the origin. This is going to help us when we're looking at the definitions of specific movements. Okay, and the movement is also going to occur in certain planes, and these are all the ones that we kind of looked at originally, but now we're sort of putting them into practice. And the movements are also going to occur around certain sort of axes. Okay, so we're back to this transverse, frontal, and sagittal plane. Sometimes when you're working out, or you hear people talking about different exercises, they're going to talk about, hey, this is a sagittal plane exercise or a frontal plane exercise, and this is kind of what they're kind of meaning. So we're back to this picture, and again, for me, I really just want you to know, okay, what does this plane divide my body into? So sagittal is left and right, frontal is front and back, and then transverse is going to divide me into a top and a bottom. We get a couple more little definitions here. So we talk about the range of motion in synovial joints. We're going to get a couple other little classifications. So we're going to have what's called non-axial movement. This is going to be just slipping movements. We're going to have a uniaxial movement, and that means it only moves in one plane. We're going to have a biaxial movement, and that's going to move in two planes. And then we're going to have a multi-axial movement, and that's going to move in all three planes. And you can sort of think about all the joints in your body, where you can think about your elbow, it really just moves in one direction, but then you can think about your hip or your shoulder, which are going to move in a lot of different planes in kind of every different direction. So we just want to make sure we can kind of think about each joint and think about, okay, how many planes does this joint actually kind of move in? But good multiple choice question here. So we get three types of movements. We get gliding movements, we get angular movements, and then we get these rotational movements. And again, these are good multiple choice questions, so you just want to have an understanding of, okay, these are the three types, and then what's the difference between each of these, and we're going to look at that as we go through the next couple slides here. Okay, so gliding movements, you have flat or nearly flat bone surfaces, okay, and then they're going to just glide or slide over top of each other. There's going to be this back and forth or side to side kind of movements, and this is the important part. There's no appreciable angulation, and what they're talking about with angulation is there's no change in the angles between the joints. Okay, so no change in the angles between the joints, and then no rotation. The best examples of these are going to be the bones that are kind of in your wrists and in your ankles. So it's my intercarpals, my intertarsal joints, and then my vertebrae are also going to move with these sliding movements. Okay, so here is if you're moving your wrist kind of back and forth, and you can kind of put your fingers on either side, and you can kind of feel these little carpal bones that we already learned and sort of know how to name at this point. You can feel them kind of sliding against each other. Okay, but those are going to be my gliding movements of my wrist. So no change in the angles between these bones and no real rotation in the bones. So now we get to the ones that we mostly think of, and these are going to be our angular movements, okay? Again, when you see angular, you're just talking about angles, and what's going to happen is that there's going to be an increase or a decrease in the angle between two bones, okay? So angular, it sounds really complicated, but it's just really, okay, is the angle increasing or is it decreasing? The important part with angular movements is that there's going to be a change, okay? And again, movement can occur in any plane, and these are the main motions that you want to sort of be aware of, and then we'll add one more kind of at the end, but we're talking about flexion, extension, we're talking about abduction, adduction, We're talking about horizontal abduction, horizontal adduction, and then internal and external rotation. And I want to be just clear about, you want to make sure that you know, okay, my shoulder joint goes through these motions. My elbow is, performs these sort of motions. So you want to sort of work through each joint in the body. And again, the elbow and the knee are very similar. The hip and the shoulder are very similar, but we want to have an idea of, okay, what are the movements that are created at these different little joints? And we already know that some joints have a lot of motion and some joints are not going to have as much motion. So we're going to look at these a little more individually too. So here is an example of the changing in the angle. Okay, so this is my arm, and when it's straight, this angle between these two bones is about 180 degrees, right? Because it's a straight line. And then when I bend my elbow, okay, so I use my bicep to bend my elbow, the angle between these two bones is going to change. So this bone and this bone, now it's at about a 90-degree angle. Okay, so that angle is going to decrease. Okay, and that's going to tell us, okay, is the angle decreasing or is the angle increasing? That's going to tell us if we're talking about flexion or we're talking about extension. Okay, so here is flexion and extension from like a biology sort of definition. So flexion is a bending movement, and what's going to happen is you're going to get this decrease, okay, in the angle between those two bones. Okay, so decreases the angle of the joint and brings the bones closer together. And if I come back to this picture again, right, so here is my elbow when it's straight, and then I flex that muscle, and I bring this bone closer, and now the angle between those two bones is smaller because it's not 180 anymore, it's 90. So I know that I'm talking about flexion, okay? And if I did the opposite, so if my arm was bent and then I straightened it, I went from a 90-degree angle and now I'm at a 180-degree angle. So that is going to be extension, okay? So with extension, it's the reverse of flexion, and this is going to be the increase in the angle between the bones. So again, you just want to be just very clear with the definitions, because sometimes we think, oh yeah, okay, that's pretty simple, but then when we have to actually give the proper definition, it gets a little bit trickier, okay? But flexion is usually going to be bending, extension is usually going to be the straightening of a limb. Another good way to do it is, again, the elbow is a good one because it's really simple, but I think the best one to sort of learn all the different terms is going to be the shoulder, okay? Because it moves in all these different little directions. So you can go through all those: flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, horizontal abduction, horizontal adduction. You can do all those things with the shoulder and the hip, and then I can sort of use that to sort of figure out the other joints and sort of what things are doing. So this would be flexion of my shoulder. And again, anytime you talk about flexion, and especially when we get to the muscle chapters and you're talking about, what's the function of this muscle, you have to specify what joint you're talking about, okay? So this would be flexion of my shoulder. So if my arm is at my side and I just raise it up right in front of me, and this is what you guys want to do as you're going through this chapter, is just stand up, put your arm and say, hey, can I go through what's flexion of the shoulder? What's going to be extension of the shoulder? What's abduction? What's adduction? Go through all those things. Do the same thing with the hips, and then it'll really, really help you sort of memorize things. So flexion of my shoulder is going to be I raise my arm up in front of me, okay? Extension of the shoulder, this one's a little tricky. This is where my arm is at my side, and now I bring it behind me, okay? So flexion, extension of the shoulder. Now I get into my other movement. So now I have abduction and I have adduction. So abduction is going to be a moving away, and what you're talking about is really like the midline of the body. So is something moving towards the midline or is it moving away from the midline? Okay, and abduction, the way I always used to remember this, and it's kind of like a bad sort of way to think about, but it always kind of helps me remember, is if you watch movies where people get kidnapped or kids get kidnapped, they always talk about they're being abducted from their parents, they're being taken away from their parents. So this always helped us sort of remember that abduction was I'm moving away from midline. And what you're going to do is I'm standing again, my arm is at my side, and I'm just going to raise it up laterally, and I'm going to take it away from midline, and that's going to be abduction. And if I lower my arm back down to my side, that's going to be adduction. Okay, so I'm moving the limb towards the body midline. And here's a picture of abduction and adduction. So she started off with her arm at her side like this, and then she raises it up just laterally. That's going to be abduction. And then when she lowers it back down to her side, that's going to be adduction. You can see that it's moving in a different plane than if I raised it forward and I raised it sort of behind me. Okay, so we also have rotary motion. So rotation is the turning of a bone around its own long axis. We get a lot of this in our cervical vertebrae. Okay, and we're going to use these. We're going to sort of term them based on, are they moving again towards midline or away from midline? So we're going to have medial, okay, or sometimes you'll hear this termed internal rotation, where you're going to have lateral rotation, which is external rotation. Okay, I always did internal and external, but both are correct. One of the tricky things, especially with anatomy in general, is that there's a lot of terms that are very similar, and everybody kind of chooses the one that they like best. But it's important to sort of know that, okay, medial rotation, lateral rotation is the same as internal versus external. But again, we're talking about, am I moving it towards midline or am I moving it away from midline? So here is my, and you can see in the picture they have sort of internal or medial, and then they have external. But if you're standing and I have my elbow bent at 90 degrees and I point it directly in front of me, okay, and then I bring my hand towards my stomach, that's going to be internal rotation, okay, because I brought that towards midline. If I have my hand pointing straight out and I rotate it away, as in this picture, it's going to be moving away from midline, and that's going to be external rotation, okay. And then I can do the exact same thing sort of with my hips, okay, where I can sort of rotate things, and then I can use the shoulder to sort of figure out all those different little rotations that we're going to kind of have. Okay, so now we've done flexion, extension, we've done abduction, adduction. We just threw in the rotational ones. This is where it gets a little bit trickier with the shoulder and the hip, is that they're going to have these other actions, and they're going to be kind of like a combination, right? So these are going to be called horizontal abduction and horizontal adduction. And in this one, the only difference that you're doing, because it still deals with, am I moving towards or away from this midline, but what I've done is I've moved my arm into flexion first, okay? So this is if I'm standing, my arm is at my side, I bring it up into flexion so that it's pointing right in front of me, and then I move it out to the side, okay? So it's a combination of I've flexed it, and now I'm moving out laterally, or I'm bringing it across my body, sort of midline. So this one would be where I bring it up and move it away from me. This is going to be horizontal abduction because I've moved it away from midline. And then as I bring it back or I bring it across my body, this would be horizontal adduction. And again, I can do the same thing with my hip, right? If I bring my knee up in front of me, that's flexion. If I bring my knee behind me, just directly behind me, that's going to be extension. If I pick my leg up laterally, that's going to be abduction. If I bring it back down to my side, that's adduction. And then for these ones, what I would do is I would bring my knee up directly in front of me, so into flexion, and then I would bring it out to the side, and that would be horizontal abduction. And then when I brought it back towards midline, that would be my horizontal adduction, okay? And then the only difference with the lower extremity, because again, it's always good to sort of start from the same position, is that then you kind of do the same thing with the rotational ones, right? So I kind of rotate internally or I rotate externally. So here's some other pictures kind of from your textbook, and in this one they're kind of showing you the flexion and extension with your neck. So if I bend my chin towards my chest, that's going to be flexion. If I'm looking up at the sky, that's going to be extension. If I turn to the left, if I turn to the right, that's going to be my rotation, okay? You can see the same thing with the hips here, okay? The only thing you have to kind of pay attention to with the hips is that it's actually going to be, where does my knee go, okay? So sometimes people will get confused with like the foot and the ankle depending on how bent my knee is. So sometimes if I bend my knee and then I rotate it, it kind of looks like my foot is going towards midline. But again, with the hip ones, it's all about the knee, okay? Did I move my knee towards midline or did I move it away from midline? And that's going to tell you sort of which rotation in the hip you're kind of talking about. So now we have, again, flexion. This will be of my lumbar vertebrae where she's bending forward, or she's straightening, or she's hyperextending a little bit. Flexion, extension. I get some other pictures here where here's the one that we just kind of talked about where she's raising her arm out in front of me. So this is going to be shoulder flexion. She brings her arm behind her. That's going to be shoulder extension. And then I have this flexion of my knee. And then if she straightens her knee, that's going to be extension, right? Because now I have my femur and I have my tibia, and I've decreased this angle between those two bones. So that's flexion. And then if I straighten my leg and I make this angle really, really wide, like here, that's going to be where my knee is going to be in extension. So it's, again, one of those things where you want to sort of work through all the different joints. So go through the shoulder, go through the hip, think about the elbow, think about the knee, and then we'll talk about some terms that really just apply to specific joints in just a second here. Okay, so here's a little picture of, she raises her arm out to the side. That's going to be abduction. She brings it back down to her side. That's going to be adduction. We also get this other term called circumduction because I can hold my arm out to my side and I can just rotate it in a big circle. This one's going to be a combination of all the motions that we just kind of talked about, but it kind of creates this little cone at the bottom. So it gets its own little term. So here is circumduction, circular, cone in space. The distal end of the limb moves in a circle, so that would be your hand for your shoulder. The proximal end is going to stay stationary, and then again, this is a combination of all the motions that we just kind of talked about. Okay, so now we get some special terms. Okay, so these ones are, anytime you hear these terms, they're going to apply to specific joints or specific sort of movements in the body. So you're going to talk about supination and pronation. We've already talked about this one a little bit. This is where, I'm rotating my radius around my ulna. So this is where if I stand and I put my arm directly out in front of me, when my palm is up, that's going to be supination. Okay, and then when I rotate my palm down to the ground, that's going to be pronation. So supination, I rotate the arm laterally, my palm is up. That's the important part. Pronation, my palm is going to be down. If you hear dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, they're talking about the ankle. Okay, so dorsiflexion is I bring my toes towards my shin. Plantar flexion, I'm going to point my toes away from my shin. Okay, this is if I was doing like a toe raise, I would be doing plantar flexion if I'm raising myself up onto my toes. Inversion, eversion, they're going to be talking about the ankle again. This one's going to be mostly comes up when you're talking about ankle sprains. You're going to hear about inversion versus eversion sprain. But if I have an inversion sprain, okay, the sole is going to turn medially. So I'm going to turn the bottom of my foot towards my midline or internally. And this is kind of where I roll onto that outside part of my foot. But these are the most common are these inversion ankle sprains. And then eversion, I'm going to take the bottom of my foot. And this one's a little harder motion to do. And that's why it's so much easier to kind of sprain your ankle in inversion. Is even when I just stand there and I go into inversion, it's really easy. But when I try to evert, there's not as much motion in there. And we're a little more stable in this eversion motion. But I'm turning the sole laterally. Okay, so that's inversion, eversion. We come to protraction, retraction. You will hear about this with the jaw, and we're going to see a picture of the jaw, but probably the biggest one is going to be with your scapula. And this is that motion of my scapula sliding on my ribs, and it's either going kind of closer to my spine. If I'm retracting, I'm sort of moving that medial border of the scapula towards my spine, or if I'm kind of bringing my shoulders way forward and I'm rolling forward, or I'm reaching way forward, that scapula is actually going to slide on those ribs and it's going to move away from my spine. Okay, so that's probably the one that you'll hear more about is this protraction, retraction. We'll see a picture here in a second too. Elevation, depression. Again, you're going to talk about the scapula. And again, we're going to talk about this one when we get into the muscles a little bit. But in order to get my arm above my head, okay, I have to sort of move my scapula and I have to rotate that glenoid fossa kind of up. And this is what we're doing is we're going to have all these different little motions with that scapula to sort of put that glenoid fossa in the proper position so that I can move my arm around in all these different little directions and have all that shoulder motion. So elevation is I'm lifting that scapula. Okay, if I shrug my shoulders towards my ears, that's going to be elevation. And if I bring those shoulders back down, that's going to be my depression. And then with opposition, you're really just talking about your thumb and your fingers, and it's this ability to sort of reach across the palm of my hand and kind of touch my pinky, touch my ring finger, touch all those fingers with my thumb. Okay, so here is a picture of pronation, supination, right? So palm up, we always remember that was soup, soup has up in it, and then pronation is my palm's going to be down. Dorsiflexion, toes towards the shin, toes away from the shin, or I'm coming up on the balls of my feet. Plantar flexion, and this is going to be my inversion, so this will be her left, right, ankle, and she would sort of rotate that palm. This would be midline, and she's going to bring that sole of the foot towards the midline. That's inversion. You can think about this one again. I roll my ankle sort of and I sprain all these lateral ligaments here. We'll talk about that when we get to the muscles too. And then this is going to be the eversion where I'm going to take that bottom part of the foot and I'm going to move it towards that outside. Okay, but this one you kind of have to think about where is that midline. So midline would be right over here. Here is protraction, retraction. You can also talk about with the jaw where I can kind of jut my jaw forward here. That would be protraction, and then I can bring my jaw back, and that's going to be retraction. But again, this is probably a better way to think about it is here are my scapulas here, right? So this would be the medial border of the scapula. It would go kind of like this little triangle here, but this is the medial border, and if I bring my shoulders way back and I try to pinch these scapulas together and I move this scapula very close to my spine, that's going to be retraction. And then if you can see in this picture where he's rolled his shoulders way forward, and this border of the scapula is going to move out this way, and you can kind of see it right over here, but it's way farther away from that spine, so this is going to be protraction, okay? And this is another picture where you can see he's really squeezed his shoulders sort of back together, and this would be kind of that extreme example of retracting of those scapulas and bringing those medial borders as close to the spine as we possibly can. Okay, the last part of the part two of our audio lecture is going to be your types of synovial joints. And again, we get these 6 major categories, and we just want to just really be able to sort of give an example. And a lot of these are going to kind of make sense when you think about how your fingers move and your shoulders move and things like that. But we just want to be aware of the 6 categories and just have an example of where they would occur in the body. Okay, so we get a plane joint, and again, these are good multiple choice questions because they are all types of synovial joints. Okay, so based on the shape of their articular surfaces, synovial joints can be classified into 6 categories. So plane joint, hinge joint, pivotal joint, condylar joint, saddle joint, and then our ball and socket joint. Okay, and a lot of these we can kind of think about a hinge as like a door, and you want to think about it just like that, as it's going to move in these certain directions. So here is a picture of your plane joint, and again, these are the ones where they're just going to glide. Okay, so no axial motion. We get our hinge joint. Elbow is a great example of a hinge joint. It's only really going to move in one direction, and that's going to be flexion and extension. We get a pivotal joint, so this is my radius and my ulna, and we said that as I supinate and I pronate, this radius is going to spin, right? Spin against that ulna, and it allows me to kind of cross those bones over. This is my pivotal joint. Now we have a condylar joint, and again, this is just based on the shape of the articular surfaces. So a good example of these ones are going to be in the fingers. Now we get a saddle joint. This one's going to be more towards your thumb, and again, it's just based on, it's kind of like a saddle on a horse where you have one leg over each side, but it's just shaped like that, and that's kind of that, the shape of those articular surfaces is going to be where the name's going to come from. So saddle joint. But again, with my thumb, I can move it in a couple different directions, right? So it's biaxial. And then I have my ball and socket joint. And again, this is what we think of most of the time. This is my shoulder and my hip. And again, the ball and socket gives me this multi-axial where I can move my shoulder and I can move my hip in kind of any direction that I really, really want to. Okay, so that's it for part 2. And then we'll come back next time, and we'll have part 3 of chapter 8, where we'll look at specific joints in the body and go over some things that you have to label for your practical. And then we'll come back to chapter 6, and we'll look at all the physiology for the bones.